America will soon have its 47th president when Donald Trump retakes the office this coming January. However, if we subtract the second terms of both Grover Cleveland and Donald Trump due to their non-consecutive nature, we have only truly had 45 presidents. This list contains some of the most widely known figures in American history, from George Washington to Thomas Jefferson to Abraham Lincoln, as well as Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt. In contrast, it also contains some of the most widely forgotten and unknown presidential figures. In this list, we are going to overview the most forgotten presidents in American history. This matter can often be considered highly subjective. However, to create a concise and accurate list, I will be looking at various statistics from polls that have been taken, as well as some compiled responses from platforms such as Reddit. Martin Van Buren. Van Buren was the 8th President of the United States and would succeed President Andrew Jackson and precede President William Henry Harrison. Van Buren was a single-term president, although he attempted on numerous occasions to seek a second term. Van Buren was the first American president to be born a true U.S. citizen, as all previous presidents were considered citizens of Great Britain when they were born. Van Buren was also the only U.S. president whom English was not their primary language. His mother tongue was Dutch, as he came from a family of Dutch immigrants who settled in Kinderhook, New York. Van Buren would begin a small career in politics that eventually led to him being elected to the Senate representing the state of New York. Van Buren was a widely spoken critic of the Bank of the United States and was an advocate for the War of 1812. These positions would highly align him with policy opinions of the popular Andrew Jackson and what became the Jacksonian wing of the then Democratic Republican Party and eventual Democrat Party. Van Buren became noticed by Jackson, whom appointed him as his Secretary of State. When Jackson ran for re-election in 1832, Van Buren was chosen to be his running mate, due to Jackson and his then Vice President John C. Calhoun having an extremely bitter relationship. Jackson spoke highly of Van Buren. Jackson was once quoted as calling Van Buren a true man with no guile. When Jackson left office, Van Buren was his chosen successor. Van Buren ran in 1836 and won relatively easy due to the popularity of the Jacksonian platform. However, Van Buren would not be seen as successful or as popular as Jackson. In 1837, a financial panic occurred. Many banks and businesses would close. Van Buren and the Jacksonians were widely held responsible for this economic crash. In response to the crash, Van Buren would continue the policies of Andrew Jackson. These deflationary policies only worsened the crisis. Van Buren was also widely critical of the expansion of slave power and refused the calls for the annexation of Texas, fearing the expansion of slave power and a possible war with Mexico. Van Buren was defeated for re-election in 1840 by William Henry Harrison and his running mate John Tyler. Van Buren would attempt to seek his party's nomination again in future elections, but would be unsuccessful. In 1848, Van Buren ran as the candidate for the newly formed Free Soil Party, but again, he was not successful in his bid to return to the presidency. In his later years, Van Buren was highly critical of other presidents such as Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan. During the Civil War period, he became a war Democrat who supported the war against the Confederacy and was highly supportive of the policies of the Republican President Abraham Lincoln. Van Buren retired back to his hometown of Kinderhook, where he was an extremely vocal critic of the pro-slavery Democrats, and while he grew opposed to slavery, he was also critical of the heavily anti-slavery radical Republicans, as he believed that both sides were majorly increasing national tensions. Van Buren died in 1862 at the age of 79, being loved by his niche group of supporters, but being largely forgotten in the larger political landscape. John Tyler was the 10th President of the United States. John Tyler was born in the state of Virginia and grew up in a relatively wealthy and prominent slave family. His father had served as a judge and had been closely acquainted with both former President Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Harrison V, the father of his future running mate, William Henry Harrison. Tyler would practice law alongside his father and would rise to prominence in Virginia politics. Tyler would serve in the House of Representatives and later in the Senate, representing his home state of Virginia. Tyler had both been a vocal supporter and critic of Andrew Jackson. While he disagreed with Jackson on many issues, he was a supporter of Jackson's decision to veto the recharter of the Second Bank of the United States and would endorse Jackson for his re-election. Tyler, however, became highly disillusioned by Jackson's hold on the Democratic Party. After the nullification crisis of 1832 and Jackson's increasing use of executive power, Tyler would feel that it was in his best interest to resign his Senate position. In a letter to Vice President Martin Van Buren, Tyler stated, "I shall carry with me into retirement the principles which I brought with me into public life, and by the surrender of the high station to which I was called by the voice of the people of Virginia, I shall set an example to my children which shall teach them to regard as nothing place in office, when either is to be attained or held at the sacrifice of honor." As time went on, Tyler would become more aligned with the newly formed Whig Party. In the election of 1840, the Whig Party would again seek the presidency, after they failed to nominate a candidate during the last election. William Henry Harrison, Henry Clay, and Winfield Scott all sought the nomination. In the end, Harrison won the nomination. Tyler's name had been floated around to receive the vice presidential nomination. However, Tyler had little interest in the position and did not actively seek the job. He eventually received the nomination, though how this came to be is not entirely clear. When the election of 1840 concluded and Harrison had won the election, Tyler was not particularly interested in the job. As in all other cases, the president had fulfilled his term and the vice president did not really do that much. However, this would not be the case for Tyler. Tyler was sworn in as vice president on March 4th of 1841, and just a few days later on April 4th, Harrison would die after battling pneumonia. At this point in American history, if the president should die, the chain of succession was not clear. In the Constitution, it had dictated that, in case of the removal of the president from office, or his death, resignation, or inability to discharge the powers and duties of said office, the same shall devolve on the vice president. This, however, was not clear as to if Tyler would become an acting president and a new election were to be held, or if Tyler would automatically assume the new role as president for the remainder of Harrison's term. Regardless, Tyler decided to serve the remainder of Harrison's term, to some criticism. At the time, Tyler was the youngest U.S. president at the age of 51. To keep the criticism from Harrison's supporters at a minimum, chose to keep Harrison's cabinet. However, after some debate with the cabinet as to how decisions would be made, whether by presidential authority or a vote held by the cabinet, as Harrison had desired, Tyler would state to the members of cabinet during a meeting, "I beg your pardon, gentlemen. I am very glad to have in my cabinet such able statesmen as you have proved yourselves to be, and I shall be pleased to avail myself of your counsel and advice, but I can never consent to being dictated to as to what I shall or shall not do. I, as president, shall be responsible for my administration. I hope to have your hearty cooperation in carrying out its measures. So long as you see fit to do this, I shall be glad to have you with me. When you think otherwise, your resignations will be accepted." Regardless of his new position, his critics never saw him as president, often calling Tyler his excellency, or continuing to refer him as vice president or acting president. During his term, Tyler believed in the limitations of federal power and would follow much of the tenets of Jeffersonian democracy. Tyler always was at odds with his party and frequently went against the philosophy of his running mate Harrison. Tyler would go against his party and vetoed Henry Clay's proposal of the National Banking Act. Tyler's cabinet would resign one after the other, and many expected Tyler to resign the office as well. However, when this did not happen, he was expelled from the Whig Party. Tyler was hated by Whig newspapers and often received threats of assassination. A vote of impeachment was also brought forward. However, it failed, and Tyler escaped the title of being the first president to be impeached. The remainder of Tyler's term would be relatively uneventful and unremarkable. He attempted to return to the Democratic Party to seek re-election, however, was rejected. Tyler created a third party, known as the Tyler Party, and ran on the policy of the annexation of Texas. However, the party soon fell apart, and Tyler had no platform to stand on. On the last day of his presidency, Tyler would sign a resolution that would indeed call for the annexation of Texas, and during his successor's term, this would occur. Tyler left office and believed his successor James K. Polk reflected the nation's best interests. Tyler retired back to Virginia and lived a post-presidency of relative obscurity. Tyler would be torn on the future crisis of Civil War. While he widely supported the continuation of the Union, when the succession of the South came, he sided with Virginia over the Union. In November of 1861, Tyler was elected to the Confederate House of Representatives. However, Tyler would die of a stroke before he ever took his seat. To this day, he is the only U.S. president not to be buried under an American flag. His casket was draped in the Confederate flag. Tyler is often seen as a traitor, and is largely forgotten. Many historians say that Taylor's legacy was forever tainted by his traitorous actions and may never begin to heal. Zachary Taylor was the 12th President of the United States and served the third shortest presidential term in American history. Taylor was born in Virginia, and his family would migrate to the state of Kentucky during his youth. Taylor had an extremely successful military career. He served during the War of 1812 and the subsequent Second Seminole War. During the conflict, he earned himself the title of Old Rough and Ready. During the Mexican-American War, Taylor had several major victories, and his popularity would later push the Whig Party to nominate him as their candidate in the 1848 election. Despite this, Taylor had little interest in politics and had relatively unknown political tenets. The Whig Party chose Millard Fillmore from New York to run alongside Taylor. In 1848, Taylor won the election and became the first United States president to win the presidential election without ever holding any public office. During his term, Taylor was often reclusive, rarely ever engaging with Congress or his cabinet. Although Taylor owned slaves, he highly protested the expansion of slave power and urged the western states to move past the territorial process and immediately towards statehood. This position would set the stage for the future compromise of 1850. However, suddenly Taylor would die in July of 1850 after contracting a stomach infection. Taylor would preside, like many others on this list, over a relatively unremarkable term. Taylor was succeeded by his running mate, Millard Fillmore, which leads us into the next president on this list. Fillmore would serve out the remainder of Taylor's term and would become the 13th president from 1850 to 1853. Fillmore was born into poverty in the state of New York, but throughout his life became a prominent politician and was fairly prominent in the region of Buffalo, New York. Fillmore initially was a part of the anti-Masonic Party, but would later join the Whig Party. Fillmore was extremely critical of slavery, calling it a great evil, but declared that it would be nearly impossible for the federal government to eliminate the institution. When Fillmore became vice president, he was often ignored and even at odds with his running mate Taylor. When Taylor died, Fillmore assumed the position and pushed Congress to pass the Compromise of 1850. The Fugitive Slave Act, part of the compromise, made it law that all escaped slaves must be returned to their owners, even if they were newly free in Northern Territory. While Fillmore did not personally agree, he felt bound by his duty to see it enforced. This highly damaged his popularity and the popularity of the Whig Party. Fillmore's presidency saw some importance in foreign policy, particularly the opening up of trade with Japan. Fillmore remained unpopular and was not renominated for re-election in 1852. The Whig Party would dissolve, and Fillmore would then join the Know-Nothing Party, which focused heavily on anti-immigration rhetoric. Fillmore was mostly quiet on the topic of immigration, and focused primarily on the preservation of the Union. Fillmore was nominated by the Know-Nothing Party for the election of 1856, though it's hard to say how much of a serious run for office this was, and there's little evidence to suggest Fillmore took the nomination and candidacy seriously. Fillmore returned to Buffalo and cared little for returning to civic life. He was a staunch supporter for the preservation of the Union, and while critical of Abraham Lincoln's policies, he supported the president's desire to save the Union's decision regarding Reconstruction, and this has drawn much criticism toward Fillmore. Millard Fillmore died in 1874 and is today often regarded as one of America's worst presidents. Franklin Pierce served as the 14th President of the United States from 1853 to 1857. He was born into a prominent New Hampshire family, and his father, Benjamin Pierce, served as the state's governor. Pierce would serve in the House of Representatives and the Senate representing his home state. However, Pierce would retire from his public service and would take up a private law practice for a period of time. His wife Jane was not particularly a fan of his political career, and was a big reason why Pierce left the civic life for a period. Pierce would later serve in the military during the Mexican-American War, rising to the rank of brigadier general. In later years, he was nominated by the Democrat Party for president in the election of 1852. While relatively unremarkable to most, Pierce was mainly nominated as a compromise candidate due to the disagreements between Northern and Southern Democrats. Pierce would win the election of 1852 with his running mate William R. King. Pierce lived a fairly sad life. He and his wife lost 2 children and would lose their last son in a terrible train incident while Pierce was en route to attend his inauguration. Jane and Franklin both fell into depression, and this likely contributed to Franklin heavily relapsing with his alcohol addiction that he had given up numerous times. During Pierce's presidency, he became widely unpopular amongst his fellow Democrats. Pierce attempted to take a neutral position on many issues. However, during this period leading to the Civil War, this neutral position did little to ease tensions and only drew more criticism. Although he attempted to stay neutral, Pierce was labeled a doughface, or a northern politician with southern sympathies. The two events Pierce is most widely known for are the Gadsden Purchase and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. While the Gadsden Purchase would provide the U.S. with a small segment of land out west, and was seen in relative positive regard, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which nullified the previous Missouri Compromise, did little to help the nation in this turbulent time. The act allowed for the territories of Kansas and Nebraska to vote on whether they would become slave states or free states. Thousands of pro- and anti-slavery settlers flocked to the states, and a bloody prelude to the American Civil War would commence. Pierce would unsuccessfully attempt to be renominated, and left the White House in relative disgrace. His wife Jane died in 1863, and Pierce would live the remainder of his life battling his alcohol addiction and suffering from depression. He died alone at his home in New Hampshire from cirrhosis of the liver at the age of just 64 in 1869. Due to Pierce's Southern sympathies and his relatively damaging presidency, he is actively ranked as one of the worst presidents in American history. Buchanan served as the 14th President of the United States from 1857 to 1861. Buchanan is widely known as the president who watched the Union die. As under his presidency, the succession crisis began. Buchanan, like Pierce, was also a doughface. Buchanan was from the state of Pennsylvania and heavily supported states' rights, particularly regarding the slavery issue. Buchanan would serve in the House of Representatives and later served as minister to Russia in the Jackson administration. Buchanan would later also serve in the U.S. Senate and as minister to Great Britain in the Polk administration. In 1856, he was nominated by the Democrat Party for president and would later win. Buchanan did little to benefit the nation at this time. He heavily got involved to sway the Dred Scott case to support the pro-slavery ruling and would attempt to sway Kansas to become a slave state. He failed in this endeavor. For most of Buchanan's presidency, he was highly inactive and had pledged to only serve one term. It's likely he would never have received the nomination for re-election even if he had sought it. During the waning moments of his presidency, the southern states began their succession, and while there was most likely little he could have done, Buchanan sat and watched as one by one the southern states left the Union. Buchanan retired to public life and had little involvement in political or civic life after his presidency. He died in 1868 at the age of 77. Due to the harmful decisions and lame duck period that was his presidency, Buchanan is also ranked as one of the worst presidents in American history. Hayes was the 19th President of the United States and served from 1877 to 1881. Hayes was born in Ohio in 1822 and grew up to be a staunch abolitionist who served as a brevet major general in the American Civil War on the side of the Union. Hayes would serve a short period in Congress from 1865 to 1867 and would later serve as the governor of Ohio from 1868 to 1872. Hayes would run in the election of 1872 and won in much controversy. After a highly contested election that was decided by Congress, Hayes would be declared the victor in a somewhat controversial decision that shrouded his term in accusations of corruption. Hayes believed in the idea of a meritocratic government and would begin the early stages of civil service reform. Hayes is most widely remembered for the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, where Hayes would send federal troops to disband the strike. This would result in the deadliest conflict between workers and strikebreakers in American history. Hayes continued the tense relationship with Western Indians and expected assimilation under the Dawes Act of 1877, which allowed the president to regulate the allotment of Native American lands. Hayes had pledged not to run for a second term and retired to his home state of Ohio. Hayes remained relatively involved in politics and as an outspoken member in the Republican Party. Hayes died at the age of 70 in 1893 and is generally regarded by historians as an average or below average president. Chester Arthur served as the 21st President of the United States from 1881 to 1885. Arthur was born in Vermont, but grew up and lived in the state of New York most of his life. He was active in New York state politics and worked in several state government positions. Arthur was often viewed negatively by many due to his connections to the stalwart faction of Republicans, which heavily advocated for the continuation of the spoils system. He ran as the vice presidential candidate with James Garfield in the election of 1880. Garfield won the election in a fairly close race. However, just a few months into Garfield's presidency, Garfield was assassinated, and Arthur became the 21st president on September 19th of 1881. During his presidency, Arthur worked to rebuild the Navy and continued the process of civil service reform that began during his predecessors. Arthur would sign into law and enforce the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act of 1883. This surprised many because of Arthur's connection to the stalwart faction. During his term, Arthur would veto the first draft of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which prevented the immigration of Chinese immigrants to the United States for 20 years. However, he would sign the later draft that only prevented Chinese immigration for 10 years. Arthur would later enforce the strict immigration rules under the Immigration Act of 1882 and would reduce tariffs with the Tariff of 1883. Arthur left the presidency in 1885 and was highly regarded. Author Mark Twain once wrote about Arthur, stating, "It would be hard indeed to do better than President Arthur's administration." And journalist Alexander McClure wrote, "No man's ever entered the presidency so profoundly and widely distrusted as Chester Alan Arthur, and no one ever retired more generally respected alike by political friend and foe." Arthur did not seek a second term. Arthur had been in extremely poor health most of his term, and even did not expect to see his term to its end. He died only a year after leaving office in 1886 at the age of 57. While Arthur was fairly popular upon leaving office, in recent years he has remained relatively unknown and is ranked fairly moderately among historians. If you liked this video, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing, as it really does benefit the channel. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next one.